I've had multiple people tell me about a movie titled Messiah 2030. So I checked it out. Now, the big question is, will Yeshua return in 2030? Or are there other time frames the same data could be equally pointing to? Let's talk about it. Hey, this is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. If you haven't heard about it, there's a 2-hour presentation titled Messiah 2030 that points to Yeshua coming in 2030. It's linked in the description below. For those of you who watch our teachings, you know we don't look at particular dates, but rather discuss how we believe we should watch certain times of the year every year because of patterns given to us throughout the scriptures. Well, the cool thing about this video is the guy points to nothing but patterns throughout the scriptures to make his points. While I have concerns regarding the specific year of 2030 it points to, I believe one will struggle to debate the consistent patterns this guy presents. We'll come back to the year 2030 and how I can see other years these patterns could equally point to in a moment. But I need to tell you, I was really intrigued with this guy's presentation. It was professionally done and keeps your interest the whole way through. Well, it did for me anyway. Some may say it's too long since it's 2 hours in length. And yes, it is 2 hours long. However, it's very concise in its information. It's jam-packed, and the guy doesn't waste time in presenting the information. He doesn't go on and on, elaborating on a point here and a point there. That's something I personally highly value and try to do with our teachings as well. So, while I may currently question the ultimate conclusion this guy comes to, I highly recommend watching it, if only to see how this guy shows the scriptures have a theme that's threaded throughout the whole Bible, a theme that's right in front of us, but easily overlooked. After someone encouraged me to watch this teaching, I saw an ad for it on Facebook, so I decided to read through the comments. While the grand majority of the reviews I saw on the film was saying it's excellent, I saw where some have said, "No man knows the time of his return. Only the Father knows." While we currently don't know the day, that doesn't mean we won't know it when the time draws near. I believe we won't know the hour, but the day is something different. You can see our written teaching titled Knowing the Day for more on that. Now, I don't want to elaborate on what this guy already discusses. I'll leave all of his information for you to hear straight from him. Trust me, it's good. Really good. But to give you a small example of what he shows, here's one the guy could have used. Now, it may not be as strong as his points, but I think you'll get the picture. When looking at Job, we see some interesting elements that may look insignificant on the surface, but we know Yahweh doesn't waste words. First, Job saw 4 generations. Second, Job had 3 daughters and 7 sons. Lastly, Job died at age 140, which, when considered with the first point, it seems a generation will be generally considered 40 years. So what's the significance to these mentioned numbers? The 4 generations points to how Yeshua's first coming was on the 4th day representing the 4th millennium of time. The 3 daughters and 7 sons both point to Messiah's second coming on the 7th millennium. From the 4th day, he comes on the 3rd, landing on the 7th. And I find it interesting that only the names of the 3 daughters are given, not the sons. This is a literary highlight we can't overlook, especially when we look at the meanings of their names as shown here. I personally see these 3 women were triplets like we see with the sons of Noah. Most likely, Karen was the oldest and Jemima was the youngest. Jemima meaning little dove. If that is indeed the case, with Jemima being the youngest, then this would point us to the Song of Solomon, as he refers to his bride as a dove in chapter 2 and in chapter 5, thus showing how Yeshua takes his bride, the dove, on the third day, which is the seventh day, the millennium. And lastly, we see Job living 140 years. Ironically, we see 140 jubilees is 7,000, the completion of man's time on earth before it's renewed for the eighth day, eternity. Now, I know this by itself isn't all that convincing. However, when you see how this is seen over and over again throughout the scriptures, as this guy presents, you start to see it can't just be a coincidence. I encourage all students of the Word to watch Messiah 2030 when they can. Now, while I can see everything this guy is pointing to, I'm wondering if these patterns could be pointing to another year just the same. I'm not saying what he's presenting is wrong, just wanting us to be open to other considerations. None of what I'm going to submit here changes the overall mechanics of what Messiah 2030 presents, but rather, I'm considering different years for when the end of the 2,000 years would land. You see, the year 2030 is ultimately selected based on the assumed year of Yeshua's death. But maybe we should consider this based on Yeshua's birth. Let me explain. When studying the birth of Yeshua, we're forced to look into the death of Herod. I really can't get past the seeming fact that Herod died in 4 BC. I've seen a few point to 1 BC based on some other eclipses that took place in 1 BC. Supposedly, those eclipses could have also been what Josephus was referring to at the time of Herod's death. But when looking at other timestamps for Herod's reign and his son's reign, 4 BC wins hands down to me. Now, I've always been of the mindset, wrong or right, that Yeshua was 2 years old when the Magi came. This is based on what we see in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16, where it says Herod gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. This would imply, to me anyway, that Yeshua was 2 years old at this time. If that's correct, and going under the thought that Herod died the same year he ordered the mass killing of the male children, Yeshua was actually born in 6 BC. Why is this important? Because we know Yeshua was just under 30 when he started his ministry. This is seen here in Luke chapter 3, verse 23. I know some would say, wait a minute, Luke doesn't say Yeshua was under 30. He says Yeshua was about 30. So Yeshua could have been 31 or even 32. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Regarding the word about, it's used in ways that definitely carries the essence of close to. Here's a few others. Matthew chapter 14, verse 21. Luke chapter 9, verse 14. Luke 22, verse 41. So this word definitely carries the meaning of an approximation. And we see Luke used the same word in chapter 9 and chapter 22, while also using it to record Yeshua being about 30 when he started his ministry. That being the case, why would Luke specifically use this word for when Yeshua started his ministry, when he tells us specifically how Yeshua was 12 years old here in Luke chapter 2? In fact, Luke states this specific information about Yeshua in chapter 2, but then only one chapter later tells us he was about 30 when he started his ministry. If Yeshua was indeed 30 when he started his ministry, why didn't Luke say it that way as he did in chapter 2. Plus, Luke is rather specific on other elements relating to time as well. In fact, he states how a specific number of years has passed in other parts of his writings, seen here in Luke 2 regarding the prophetess Anna, and also seen here in Acts 7 regarding Moses and the burning bush. Knowing Luke writes in this manner regarding the passage of time, if Yeshua was over 30, he would have said how 30 years had passed before Yeshua started his ministry. But with presenting it in the fashion he did, it shows Yeshua wasn't yet 30 years old when his ministry began. Talking about Yeshua's ministry, there are generally two schools of thought regarding how long Yeshua's ministry lasted. Some believe his ministry with his disciples was for 3.5 years. And then there's the view that I lean to, with it only lasting a little over a year. So, going from birth to the time of his ministry at 29 years of age, we have, first consideration, Yeshua was born in 6 BC. He would have started his ministry in the year 23 at the age of 29. If his ministry was only 1 year in length, he then died 1 year later in the year 24. Thus, 2,000 years later points to the year 2024 for the millennium to begin. This would imply something has to start this year for things to begin under our theory of the tribulation being cut short to a year or less. I'll cover more on that in a moment. Second consideration, Yeshua was born in 6 BC. He would have started his ministry in the year 23 at the age of 29 and died 3.5 years later in the year 26. Thus, 2,000 years later points to the year 2026 for the millennium to begin. Third consideration, Yeshua was born in 4 BC just before Herod's death. He would have started his ministry in the year 25 at the age of 29 and died 1 year later in the year 26. Thus, 2,000 years later points to the year 2026 for the millennium to begin. Fourth consideration, Yeshua was born in 4 BC just before Herod's death, would have started his ministry in the year 25 at the age of 29, and died 3.5 years later in the year 28. Thus, 2,000 years later points to the year 2028 for the millennium to begin. This is simply showing other options as to how the 2,000 years could play out as shown in the Messiah 2030 video. One impressive point in the Messiah 2030 video was how the Jews documented several different anomalies that occurred for 40 years straight leading up to the temple destruction in 70 CE, thus implying Yeshua's death was the start of those 40 years. The anomalies were: the western light wouldn't shine, the crimson thread remained crimson, the lot for the Lord always came up in the left hand on atonement, and though they closed the gates of the temple every night, they would find them wide open every morning. Those anomalies are documented in these two accounts as noted and expanded on in the Messiah 2030 video. Again, worth the watch for every believer. While I can definitely see these as signs for the temple destruction, at the same time, we have nothing given to us in the scriptures saying this was going to happen 40 years immediately following Yeshua's death. Thus, it's assumed Yeshua's death was the start for those 40 years. I believe those 40 years of recorded anomalies could easily be a warning just the same, likened, if you will, with Jonah, 40 being a number of completion for a time of repentance. However, nothing necessitates that duration to be in direct correlation to Yeshua's death, but rather the coming judgment. Again, I'm not saying the Messiah 2030 video is wrong here. I'm just giving us other time perspectives on the topic that could apply. Let it be known that my family and I will definitely be watching the 2030 time frame as it approaches. However, there's another time frame that has me equally intrigued right now. It's the year 2024. Not only because of what I explained regarding how I see it matches best from Yeshua's birth, but from what I've recently ran across in the prophets, specifically the prophet Zechariah. You see, many point to May 1948 as to when Israel became a nation, but that's not true. May 1948 was when Britain gave up their rule after 30 years of being over the land. After many formal meetings, it wasn't until March 8th of 1949 that Israel formed its first government, with David Ben-Gurion as prime minister. That following March 30th was the first day of the Hebrew year on our calendar. Thus, the government was in place just in time for the Hebrew New Year. So, why is this important? I'll show you. Zechariah chapter 1, verse 12. Then the angel of Yahweh said, Yahweh Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah, which you have been angry with these 70 years? First, the Hebrew says, how long until you withhold mercy from Jerusalem? Meaning, mercy is being given right now, but a time is coming when it won't be. The question seems to be asked in the sense that something should have started already. The report from the angels on the horses was peace, not war, seen here in verses 8 through 11, as if something should have been building up towards war at this time. Then we see the already noted verse 12. Zechariah is seeing this vision of the future, and it's a time where Yahweh has been angry with Judah for 70 years. This is a timestamp we can't ignore. Plus, we see in verse 7 that the vision takes place on the 24th day of the 11th month. So, this vision took place on the 24th day of the 11th month on a 70th year for Judah. 70 years that Yahweh's been angry with them. When has Yahweh been angry with his people in the past? When they didn't follow his ways, his Torah. When Israel started their own government as a formal nation again, they had the opportunity to make Torah the law of the land. But they didn't. They chose the government of man to be what ruled them. Thus, Yahweh's people in Yahweh's land choosing to not be governed by Yahweh's law. Not a good combination. When we go forward to the 24th day of the 11th month in the 70th year after Israel started their government of man, we land on February 18th of 2020, which just so happened to be the same time as lockdowns were starting because of the global medical situation at that time. So Zechariah could have been seeing a vision of the heavenlies in the future on February 18th of 2020. But as the vision showed, there was no threat of a global war, something evidently needed. Though the world condition was primed for something to be ushered in, the element of global war wasn't seen as reported by the horsemen. And so we see the question of how long until. But again, the vision was showing it was a time of 70 years for Judah, while keeping the understanding of the timing pointed to in Messiah 2030. Let's consider Psalm 90. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? Knowing Yahweh speaks to his people collectively as a person, this reference could apply to his people as a whole just the same. In other words, 2030 would be the 80 years from when Israel's government started. As we already pointed out, 2020 is the 70 years. But if this is to apply with the 70 years in 2020, why didn't something start then? This is where Yeshua's death in the year 24 comes into play. As we've noted in multiple other teachings on how Yeshua cuts the tribulation short, it's cut short by being delayed in its start, meaning it doesn't start on time and then have the end cut off, but rather it ends at the appropriate time but has the beginning delayed. This is even implied in Revelation 14, verse 6, when the angel specifically says, "There will be no more delay." Thus, the 1,290 days of Daniel was to start in 2020. But because it's cut short by being delayed, it didn't start then. However, the end is still to come on time. So, just as when the medical situation was at its prime in causing lockdowns around the world, we see Zechariah showing us it was being delayed. Delayed to when, though? That's the question. Knowing Yeshua was our Passover lamb and rose on first fruits, how do we see him closing out his ministry on earth? From first fruits on, we know he appeared to his disciples for 40 days up to the 27th day of the second month. Thus, it's possible he resumes his ministry here on earth on that same day, 10 days before Shavuot, Pentecost. He appears that day in the clouds to all men. Then the 10 days for Smyrna begin, with the resurrection taking place on Shavuot. For more on this, please see our teaching as in the days of Noah, the 4th edition. It goes into great detail explaining the parallels of Yeshua's return to the timing of Noah and how it correlates to Yeshua's ascension, along with Shavuot. Though we watch all the appointed times in the scriptures for Yeshua's return, the time of Noah to Shavuot, along with the Day of Atonement, are the two we lean to the most. We have teachings linked below for more information on those days. I know many say the day of Shavuot was already fulfilled, but according to the scriptures, what happened in the 2nd chapter of Acts was just a deposit of what's to come. So, if the deposit came on the day of Shavuot, there's good reason to believe the fulfillment of that deposit will come on that day as well. Again, we cover that in our teachings as in the days of Noah, the prophetic significance of Shavuot, and images of Shavuot. The timing of Shavuot can also explain what Daniel gives us in Daniel chapter 12, where it says, "It will be for a time, times, and a half a time. When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed." The verse is specifically addressing the length of time until the remnant will be broken. In other words, fully humbled. The Hebrew word for time and times here is actually moed and moedim, Yahweh's appointed times, what many refer to as feast days. The Hebrew word for half a time is chatzi. It simply means in the midst of. So it will be for 3 full moed and end in the midst of one. Thus, Shavuot, a moed, trumpets, an atonement, moedim. And then in the midst of Sukkot, the bowls begin closing out the tribulation with Armageddon on the last great day. Just as much as we don't like setting dates, we don't like setting years either. But I have to confess, I find this year leading into 2024 to be one to watch. And I've seen multiple ways in how it could play out. All I'm saying here is, I believe we've entered into a time where we need to be aware. The Messiah 2030 video gives tons of evidence that we simply can't dismiss. Whether the year it points to is correct or not, well, that remains to be seen. As I always say, time is the ultimate test. But I can sincerely say I'm thankful the Messiah 2030 video was made, as I believe it shows the finger of Yahweh in even the smallest of details established in the Scriptures. Click its link below and give it a watch today. You'll be glad you did. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.